here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my piece, Celestial Orbits. I really feel like, at least as of now, that's the best piece I've ever written. And I say that probably more because of the challenges I faced when writing that piece. The entire piece is a musical palindrome, so obviously that presented some practical challenges for creating a piece that has structure and coherence and actually works going both ways. Musical palindrome sounds the same backwards and forwards. Now I started working with palindromes when I was doing my chakras piece. That's a chamber piece for woodwind quintet and percussion. You can also check that out on my channel. But as soon as I finished that piece, I wanted to follow up with some of the work I was doing with palindromes, and I came up with the idea of doing an entire piece that was a palindrome. And I'm well aware that that's not an original idea. There have been other composers that have written pieces that were palindromes, but there haven't been very many of them, probably because it's kind of tricky and I had to figure some things out while I was working on this piece. One of them was the structure. How would I structure this piece so that it made sense, that it made musical sense, but also was actually a real, literal palindrome? And the solution that I came up with was to think of the structure like a sine wave. The piece depicts the celestial motion of planets and stars and celestial bodies. That's why it's called Celestial Orbits. So it depicts a circular motion, and any sort of oscillating or circular motion can be represented mathematically by a sine wave. So a very simple sine wave, you got this up and down like that, right? So if I use that as kind of a representation of the relative, excuse me, my allergies are acting up a bit. So if you think of that sine wave as representing the relative motion of the planets and representing relative thickness and thinness of orchestration. So for example, at the peak of the sine wave would be where the piece was thickest in the orchestration, and at the trough of the sine wave would be where it was thinner and quieter in orchestration. So my solution was to kind of use that sine wave as a guide for structuring the piece, and starting from peak to peak rather than, for example, trough to trough, which would give you a piece that started quietly, became very big, and then ended quietly. It might not give you a sense of musical satisfaction of it ending. I also considered the possibility of maybe starting at a midpoint and then going through one cycle and ending at another midpoint, but then that wouldn't be an exact palindrome. An exact palindrome would have to be either peak to peak or trough to trough, or only some small subsection of that wave. So I decided that the peak to peak made the most sense. Start big, let it thin out, then it builds back up and ends big at the end. So that solved the issue, at least as far as the structure. However, some of the details of working within that presented some challenges. Making a piece that ends and begins as a palindrome of each other in a way that's convincing, a convincing beginning and a convincing ending. I hope I've done this here. I actually did cheat on one small case. You'll hear at the very end there's an extra gliss that happens in the horns that I actually wrote out. I could have just written a line. I decided to just write that out, which is not written that way in the beginning. But other than that small, tiny detail, it is really a literal palindrome, the entire piece. And I decided to add that gliss because I felt it just added a little bit more finality and drama to the end of the piece, which just helped give it a little bit more of a sense of closure. Because again, to get the beginning and ending in an exact palindrome, that was a big challenge. The other challenge that I found as I was working on this piece was doing transitions. Because creating like a static section that is the same both ways was relatively easy. It's not that hard to do that. But getting those sections, moving from one section to another section convincingly, both backwards and forwards, that was a challenge. And the solution that I came up with for that, first of all, going back a little bit, this is a 7-minute piece. So there did have to be multiple sections of the piece to give it a sense of structure. And it needed to go through different key areas. Not that it's a traditionally tonal piece, but it is kind of tonal. Just not in the traditional, dominant tonic kind of way. So it does need to go through various key centers in order to have that sense of variety, so you don't get bored hearing the same key throughout the entire 7-minute piece. So then the challenge became, well, how can I change from one key center to the next and have it convincing and not just do a sudden immediate change, which I suppose it could do, just a sudden immediate change. But I wanted to create something with a little bit more cleverness and craft than that. So my solution was to use the mediant relationship. And you'll notice that the key structures of the piece, starting in C, going to E, going to A flat, then to C again, then A flat, E, C, it essentially outlines an augmented chord, which is good for that symmetry of the entire piece. And also I used augmented chords to make that transition happen. The mediant relationship, so for example, going from the key of C to the key of E is a mediant relationship, and it sounds very similar going from C to E versus E to C. And there's a very simple, easy way to make that change. So for example, if you're in the key of C, you have your major chord C, E, G. That G goes up to G sharp, becomes an augmented chord, and then you reinterpret that augmented chord as an E augmented chord. And then you allow the fifth, that sharp fifth of that E to then drop down, so that C then drops down to B, and then now you're in the key of E. So it's very simple, up to the augmented, and then the new reinterpreted augmented chord, that sharp 5 resolves back down. And if you look closely at every key change within the piece, you'll hear it happening in the horns each time. That's essentially what's happening to make those key changes work and sound good going backwards and forwards. So yeah, overall I feel very good about how the piece turned out. The piece works, it works as a palindrome, it works structurally, the musical textures I think really depict, at least in my mind, the way I feel it, it really depicts. It's easy to imagine the motion of the heavenly bodies when you hear this piece of music. I do hope that people do like the piece, that bands and wind ensembles do enjoy playing it, because I enjoyed writing it, and it actually went a lot faster than I thought it would. This is a piece I expected to spend months writing on. It took me maybe like 6 weeks, I guess, a month to 6 weeks to do this piece, which is way faster than I imagined it would go. I do really enjoy writing for wind ensemble. I love the wind ensemble. I have a lot more ideas for stuff that I want to do for wind ensemble. So I'm hoping that this piece does catch on, that it does get some performances, that people really do like it. I also wrote another fun piece for wind ensemble called Heroes and Villains, which is totally cinematic. In fact, one of the themes in that piece was taken from a film score that I did when I was in LA. From Malice, and you can check that piece out as well. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.